Shortly before November the 1st, 1917, the French munition ship Mont Blanc set sail from New York to Halifax, Nova Scotia. She carried over 2,600 tons of explosives, consisting of TNT, picric acid, benzol, and gun cotton, all destined for the Western Front. For over 3 terrible years, the war in Europe had dragged on with staggering losses. The French government's New York agent was buying munitions in such quantities that 20 ships a week were needed to keep up with the demand at the front. The war on the ground had developed into a stalemate of trench warfare, with each side trying to blast the other into submission. Entire villages and towns were obliterated from the face of the earth. Whole divisions of troops were slaughtered in successive but senseless frontal advances that gained nothing for either side. The war in the air was fought just as bitterly by young men in fabric-covered aircraft. The horrendous convoy losses from German U-boats and surface raiders were such that every available vessel that could float had been pressed into service. Were it not for this desperate situation, the Mont Blanc would already have been scrapped. But 1,134 British ships had been sunk in 1917. In the previous week alone, 21 vessels had gone to the bottom. So it was that the Mont Blanc's 39-year-old captain, Aimé Lemedec, received orders to sail north and join a convoy that was assembling in Halifax. It was his first voyage on the vessel. The port of Halifax is one of the finest harbors in the world. It resembles a giant flask, with the cities of Halifax and Dartmouth on either side of a narrow neck. The neck opens into the protected shelter of Bedford Basin, where the huge convoys assembled for the treacherous Atlantic crossing. Cargo vessels, troop ships, warships, and minesweepers filled the harbor as each convoy gathered. During World War I, Halifax was one of the busiest ports in the British Empire. Enormous quantities of supplies and munitions passed through its harbor. Trainloads of grain from the prairies, lumber from the west coast, guns, shells, and vehicles to be taken on board the waiting ships for the war in Europe. Founded in 1749 as a deterrent to France's continental ambitions, Halifax had grown to a modern city of 38,000, the largest in Atlantic Canada. It had developed into a vibrant city with 3 miles of wharves, a first-class dry dock, huge coaling facilities operated by the Royal Navy, and a large railway terminal. Most of the city's structures were made of wood. The old town clock on the side of Citadel Hill, built by Queen Victoria's father, was the most prominent landmark. There were electric trams, cobblestone streets, paved sidewalks, and an exciting nightlife for the sailors and soldiers who filled the city. Halifax was the embarkation point for tens of thousands of Canadian, West Indian, and American troops going overseas to the bitter winter of the Western Front. On Monday, December 3rd, 3 days after the Mont Blanc had sailed from New York, the single-screw 5,000-ton freighter Emo dropped anchor by the western shore of Bedford Basin. She was under charter to the Belgian Relief Commission. The words Belgian Relief were painted boldly on either side of her hull. Mont Blanc appeared off Halifax. In New York, every precaution had been taken to isolate the cargo under the sealed hatches. Oil lanterns, open flames, matches, and smoking were prohibited. Harbor pilot Francis Mackey came aboard to guide the vessel into port. Mackey, a 24-year veteran, had piloted several thousand vessels in and out of the harbor without incident. Lemedec hoped to reach the safety of Bedford Basin, but was ordered to anchor off McNabb's Island until morning, when the submarine net would be open again for traffic. December the 6th dawned bright and clear. A thin haze hung over the harbor. The wind was calm. At 7:30 a.m., the gate in the submarine net was opened, and ships which had anchored overnight prepared to proceed through the harbor narrows and into Bedford Basin. At the same time as the Mont Blanc was entering the harbor, the Emo lifted her anchor in Bedford Basin and headed toward the narrows. At the other end of the narrows, Mont Blanc steamed along the Dartmouth shore, keeping to the right in its proper channel. Captain Lemedec and pilot Mackey sighted the Emo. Mackey ordered Lemedec to give one blast of the ship's whistle to indicate that he intended to pass on the Dartmouth side, port to port, the correct course. Harbor rules state that the ship giving the first signal is considered to be in command of the situation. Lemedec's one sharp blast established that Mont Blanc was in her proper channel. But to Mackey and Lemedec's amazement, Emo returned the signal with two whistle blasts, signaling that she intended to move closer to the Dartmouth side as well. Lemedec gave another blast, indicating a move to his right, still closer to the Dartmouth shore. The Emo continued on its course. Had the Emo swung towards Halifax, all would have been well. Mackey and Lemedec grabbed the whistle cord, sending two short blasts and yelling at Mont Blanc's helmsman to swing the ship left across Emo's bow. Briefly, the ships were parallel, when suddenly Emo gave three blasts, signaling that she was going full speed astern. She struck the Mont Blanc, missing the TNT, but penetrating into number 3 hold, where the barrels of picric acid were stowed. Sparks flew. A thin column of smoke rose from the open wound.
My dad was in the house. He was having his breakfast. He didn't go to work till around 9 o'clock. So I went in the house and I said, Papa, I said, the two boats just hit in the harbor there, I said, and one of them was on fire.
And as I recall, it was on a sunny morning, and we heard the fire engines going, answering a call. My sister happened to be home that day. She was 12 years old from school because of she had a cold. And we went out in the lawn, my mother, my sister, and I, to watch what was going on. We could see smoke and that sort of thing.
No, I was working aboard the Middleham Castle. We were down in the engine room on the ship when somebody put the head in through the door up, said two ships just collided right off of this here. So, y'all young fellas, we rushed up.
Black smoke on board the Mont Blanc was so thick that it was impossible to see if the fire had begun in the benzol or the picric acid. Captain Lemedec and pilot Mackey shouted the order, "Look to your boats!"
And I got down to the corner of Room Street and Camel Road, and just then a friend of ours, Mr. Creighton, he'd come up, he was down to the boat, and he said to me, he knew me, you know, knew the whole family, and he said to me, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going down to see the fire." He said, "Oh no," he says, "don't go down there," he says, "because there's bullets on there and they're exploding, you might get one in your leg."
I was 16 years old. I was driving a grocery wagon then. I was sitting there, and the first thing, Frank Duxbury, a young boy going to school, he said, "I'm going up." So I said, "You get in." I said, "I've got to go up there." We were both sitting there. And then the next thing I thought I was dreaming. You know.
The last thing I remember seeing on the Mont Blanc was men running on the stern. I suppose they were going to try and tow her up, and then she blew up.
A sudden whirlwind of fire, smoke, and debris exploded into the morning sky. Higher and higher it rose, lifting and consuming within its bowels the shattered remains of the Mont Blanc. The aftershock from the explosion swept out from the harbor across the north end of Halifax and Dartmouth with the force of a battering ram. It smashed everything in its path. Windows were blasted instantaneously into glass shards. People, horses, vehicles, and buildings were suddenly lifted into the air, as the shock wave rolled across the city in a thunderous boom of destruction. Ships were driven ashore or capsized. The dockyards, the adjoining warehouses, and the Naval College were destroyed. Houses collapsed about the heads of their occupants or simply disappeared into a pile of twisted lumber. Entire families were pinned or buried in the wreckage. A few concrete, brick, and stone buildings withstood the blast. Others were only partially damaged, but most were destroyed. The destruction covered 325 acres, 1/5 of the city. Power lines, telephones, water hydrants, and radio towers had been blown away. The mind-numbing devastation was unlike anything imaginable. Veterans, hardened from the horrors of the Western Front, said the wreckage of Halifax was worse than anything they had seen during the war. Fires erupted and spread quickly, adding to the devastation. People, dazed and dumbfounded, walked amid the rubble of their streets. Some were naked and blackened, their clothing burned or blasted away. Others who had lost their shoes limped on raw and bleeding feet. Men, women, and children stared blankly at missing limbs as they bled to death. In the North End rail yards, splintered boxcars and their cargoes littered the tracks. Maintenance sheds, equipment, spare parts, and workshops were rubble. The city's main railway station blew apart and collapsed. Oddly, most of the tracks survived. The explosion beached the Emo on the Dartmouth shore. Of the Mont Blanc, there was little left. This part of its anchor had been hurled 2 miles across the city and embedded 6 feet into the ground. This 177 miles away, near the village of Bedeck on Cape Breton Island, Alexander Graham Bell reported from Ben Bria, his summer home, that windows rattled and the ground shook. Always the scientist, the 70-year-old inventor, calculated immediately the time of the explosion based on how long it would take the sound to travel from Halifax. Just under 14 minutes. He sent a telegram at once offering help.
The explosion had gone, and it had blown us, I figured about 250 feet up Duffer Street, and that was right opposite School Street. And after this mess of water and oil kept running down, I turned, looked up, and I could just see the sun starting to break through the big black smoke. And I thought to myself, I wonder what happened, Frankie. And I turned around, he wasn't 10 feet away from me, and he was just getting up, but he had lost his jacket, I had lost mine, and he still had the school bag over his shoulder, which was amazing, you know. So he said, I better get up to school. And I said, no, Frank. I said, why don't you go down? I said, because they just lived just the next door to the store, you know. I said, and see I said, you know, what happened down there. And the other 4 children and his mother were killed in the house.
The first thing I saw when I straightened out and the ships were jumping up and down was a foot I could see through the door on the deck, laying outside, with brown button boots on. And one of the friends had brown button boots on. So I went down and took a hold of the leg to pull it in, then I pull him in, and I saw the back of his head was crushed in where he'd been up against it, and he was one of our fellows.
The first thoughts were that it was a bombardment or a raid. It wouldn't be by aircraft, because in those days that was not a common thing. It was felt more that there might be battleships off the coast bombarding the city, and that was the feeling we had that was what happened. Because you have to remember, in those days there was no radios as we know them, and while some people have telephones, they of course were knocked out, but there was no means of communication.
Firemen, police, and the Army were first on the scene to organize rescue operations. Companies of uniformed troops picked their way carefully through the devastation, listening for cries for help. The blinded, the maimed, and the wounded were transported to hospitals for treatment. Work crews began clearing passageways through the littered streets. Firefighters fought fires wherever they erupted, and it was cold. Troops uncovered squalling babies, wandering tots, and bewildered children blew from the cold. Young Annie Liggins was found under the stove where she had been buried for 26 hours. The back of this photograph is inscribed by Sergeant Major Davis, her rescuer.
Annie Liggins, ashpan baby, received after being buried for 26 hours under the ashes of the house. The compliments of Sergeant Major Davis. Apparently he was the one that really found me, and then they started digging for Mr. Henneberry had the dog, and they started snuffing around.
Hundreds of bodies and body parts were collected and labeled. Any letters, school books, or items found nearby which the searchers felt might shed light on their identities were sent to the hastily prepared mortuaries.
The next thing I remember was that recovering from being knocked down to the ground, being unconscious for a while, I guess. But some of the things I remember, one thing, my mittens were blown off my hands and they were up in the tree. And next door to us, my mother's father and mother lived in a bungalow, and he was trapped in the basement, my grandfather. And somehow my mother gathered enough strength up to go down and carry him out. She doesn't know yet how she was able to do that, but the house was damaged badly. We couldn't go back into the building. So we went across some fields behind the house. And as I remember one oddity, there were some horses postured back there, and one horse had a saddle, which was completely turned around underneath him. But he was still calmly grazing in the field there.
They had taken me to the hospital, but in the meantime, my auntie and them were shifted off to Truro, and so the next morning they happened to come back and looked around and to see if they could find us, and they went through the morgue and the hospital, then they went to where all the children were, and I probably was sitting up in bed, and when I happened to see my auntie and my grandmother, well, I cried for them. Well, in the meantime, when Mr. Henneberry was saying that I was his child, he was wondering, what am I going to do with the baby? I have no one, I can't find anybody. So in the meantime, this woman and her husband were looking for somebody, and they said they would take me. They were to adopt me. And so this is what they were going to do. But of course, when my auntie and my grandmother came in, oh, I was really on for them.
At the corner of Young Street here was a house, the whole side was standing out, and a man and a woman up on the second floor yelling for help. So we crawled in over the thing and stood underneath them, and she was holding the child, probably about a year old, I guess. And so throw the baby down. They threw the baby down, and we were yelling at night, "You jump!" And he was trying to get her, make her jump, and I was yelling, "You jump! We'll catch you!" Finally, she did, and this place was burning, mind you. And then he jumped first, then she jumped. And when we walked out, I looked in the basement, and here I saw an old fellow in there standing dumb. So I crawled in over the debris and took him by the hand and brought him out.
Every house was either on fire or half blown down. And there were houses on both sides.
Everyone living in the city's north end had suffered the loss of at least one relative or a loved one. The devastation was awesome. The task of cleaning up the mess almost beyond comprehension. Next morning, it began to snow. One of the worst blizzards in years raged throughout the day.
It was a general store, and so he went in, and the grocery clerk lady was on one side of him, and the dry good lady was on the other, and they were standing in the door looking out just when the explosion happened. He was blown out onto the street. He had a broken hand, a wrist, and so the two girls, they were killed. Both of them were killed, and his family, they lived upstairs over the store, and it was his mother and his father, sister, and another brother, and a gentleman that boarded with them for years, and his wife, they were only married about 6 months previously. They were all killed.
The search for bodies continued. It took many weeks to find them all. Dogs were used to sniff out the corpses. Men and women, bundled against the cold, wandered through the shelters, hospitals, and finally the mortuaries, searching the faces for their loved ones. More than 1,600 people were killed instantly. 9,000 others were injured, and some of these would die later. The frozen corpses were carried to collection points that served as outside morgues. Those that could be identified were brought indoors, wrapped, and placed in coffins for burial. Coffins were brought in by rail from nearly every town in the province. Coffin makers worked round the clock. On December 17th, burial services, one Catholic, one Protestant, were held for the unidentified dead. Thousands attended. Many felt they might be paying their last respects to lost relatives. The aftermath of the explosion left an extraordinary number of unidentified babies and toddlers. Children's wards in the city's hospitals filled. With a shortage of crib space, the babies were laid next to each other in adult beds. Every doctor, nurse, and trainee in the armed forces and the province was pressed into service. Young medical students at Dalhousie University, just beginning their first semester exams, were sent out to assist. Premature and stillbirths occurred in unusual numbers. A call for doctors, nurses, and medical orderlies went out by wire across the eastern part of the country and the Boston States, as New England was called in Nova Scotia. Within 24 hours, help began to arrive from St. John, from Quebec City, from Montreal, and Boston. The appalling number and nature of eye injuries from flying glass was unique in social history. Treatment for the variety of injuries was beyond existing medical knowledge. The new techniques that were developed to help the afflicted would result in the birth of modern ophthalmology. Governor Samuel McCall of Massachusetts received news of the disaster 2 hours after the explosion. A relief train from the citizens of Boston arrived next morning. It brought trained personnel and much-needed medical supplies with a promise of much more to come. The compassion of total strangers coming from distant towns and cities to offer their services freely was unparalleled in social history. Hospital trains arrived daily, bringing more supplies, more equipment, and more help.
The younger brother, when the explosion happened, he hit the stove, like, you know, threw him up against the stove, and he was unconscious. So then when they took us on the train, they were going to Truro, and the doctor come through and said to my mother, he said, what's wrong with the young fella? And mother said, I think he's dead. He was unconscious, of course. And he says, well, we'll soon find out anyway. So he said to the nurse, he says, go back into the other car and get that bottle of brandy and a spoon. So she went back and got it and brought it up and gave it to the doctor. And he put a little on the spoon and put it in the young fellow's mouth, and he quivered and that. And he says, no, he says, he's not dead. He says, you just look after him till we get to Truro. And as soon as they got to Truro, they took him right to the hospital, and he was in hospital for over a year afterwards, and he had to learn to talk and walk all over again.
What I was worrying about, I had one of those dime banks hanging up in the bedroom, you know, in the cupboard. And I knew that dime bank was pretty near full for Christmas. And I looked up over and seen the whole side of the house, but you could get to the cupboard. But we didn't get there till about 3 days after. Brother Cliff and I came back, and I thought to myself, I'm going up and get my dime bank. I said, in my trousers, up there in that cupboard. Oh, no, Cliff said, no, you can't go up there the whole, no, I said, I think I can. So I went up and I crawled and held on, and everything was like that. I just reached in, grabbed the trousers, reached in, got my dime bank, and then got down and got out again. And the dime bank was just practically full.
Our main concern was looking for my father, who was missing, and my mother spent 2 weeks searching for him. And at that time it was thought that he had been killed and probably could be located in some of the morgues that were around the city. She had to visit them all and try to identify him. But strangely enough, he'd been moved from where he was picked up on the corner of Russell and Cottage Street. He'd crawled up there, eventually got up there by nighttime from Barrington Street, and picked up an ambulance, taken to Camp Hill Hospital. But he was unrecognizable because you remember that during the explosion, there was a lot of, I'm not sure what the substance was, but it covered people from head to foot, and you couldn't recognize them.
And we were getting undressed to go to bed, and Al says to me, he says, now remember, he says, you bath before you get in bed, because the sheets were white, you know.
And we couldn't get it off, you know.
So I said, okay. So I bathed and that, and we went got up the next morning, and when
The
I
pillow
got up,
slips look like terrible.
when I got up, Al said to me, he says, "I thought I told you to bath last night." I said, "I did." He says, "Well, look at the sheet." So I looked, you know. I said, "Did you bath?"
Yeah.
Yes, I bath. Look at your sheet.
Look at the pillow
It was blacker
slips.
than mine.
No one was permitted into the Richmond area without a pass. Soldiers patrolled the streets against looters. A survey of damage undertaken by Mr. Justice Harris's Financial Committee reported that while every building in Halifax and Dartmouth was more or less damaged, the devastated area is found near the scene of the explosion, chiefly in districts occupied by workers and the poorer classes. Between 3,000 and 4,000 such dwellings have been completely destroyed by the explosion or by fire. Mr. Justice Harris estimated that 25,000 people had lost their homes. His committee set up 4 food distribution depots in the area to feed the stricken families. Arthur Barnstead, chairman of the Mortuary Committee, issued a public notice asking for all unreported deaths and the disposition of bodies. Ernest Blois, chairman of the Children's Committee, published a no-nonsense notice threatening any person who, without legally constituted authority, takes and retains possession of any child is liable to prosecution and will be proceeded against. There were medical, food, fuel, transportation, and rehabilitation committees. The Committee for Reconstruction, headed by Colonel Robert F. Lowe, operated out of the Halifax Hotel. He wired an acceptance of Alexander Graham Bell's offer, and a dozen carpenters and handymen, together with food, blankets, and supplies, were sent by train from the deck. They joined the hundreds of volunteers that were arriving each day. The unstinting generosity by the citizens of Boston and the state of Massachusetts brought tears to the eyes of many Nova Scotians. Opera singer Nellie Melba, violinist Fritz Kreisler, Dr. Carl Muck, and the Boston Symphony Orchestra gave a concert. A series of benefits, receptions, and memorial services were held throughout the city and the state. Trains arrived from Boston filled with food, clothing, toys, furniture, building materials, and even baby carriages. The citizens of Massachusetts contributed over $750,000 in goods and money, an amount close to $20 million in today's terms. A substantial office staff was organized to administer and oversee the various relief and reconstruction programs. Its first and most pressing job was to feed the thousands of people who had been left destitute. Kitchens were set up at food depots. They operated from dawn till dark. People waited patiently in the cold, sometimes for hours, before receiving their food allotment. Sir John Eaton, president of the T. Eaton Company, arrived in Halifax with his own train. He opened a clothing and supply depot. Clothing boxes containing the essentials for warmth were distributed to whoever asked for them. The shortage of glass prompted one newspaper to suggest removing all glass from household pictures to use in windows. Every edition of the city's 4 newspapers carried notices asking for volunteers to help distribute the food supplies. There were help-wanted ads for glaziers, plumbers, bricklayers, electricians, and carpenters. A number of women's organizations offered help for everything from child care and family counseling to collecting, sorting, and distributing clothes. Troops of Boy Scouts ran errands for the elderly and provided messenger services until the telephone lines could be reconnected. Throughout the month, work crews continued to arrive. On December 12th, the Kelvin Austin from Boston docked with $200,000 in supplies and a gang of workmen that included glaziers and engineers. The Northland, also from Boston, reached Halifax soon after with another $100,000 worth of cargo and more volunteers for Colonel Lowe's Army of Builders. Horses, mules, and wagons were the best means of transport over the city's battered roads. A trainload of the precious animals, together with their drivers, arrived from the city of Montreal. Colonel Lowe put them to work immediately, hauling away wreckage and clearing the devastated area. Under Lowe's direction, the situation began to improve. Tents and shacks made way for temporary wooden apartments built to provide shelter for those displaced by the explosion. As hope faded for finding parents or relations of unidentified children, arrangements began for their permanent care. Some were adopted by parents who had lost their own youngsters. Others were placed in orphanages. Education took months to return to normal as teachers were busy with relief work. Some schools had been destroyed, others damaged. Still others were being used as hospitals or shelters. Eventually, a kindergarten and playground were established in the temporary housing to keep the youngsters busy. Again, there was the sound of children's laughter. Lowe's reconstruction continued. He was on the job 15 hours a day. In only 32 days, an army of workmen built 40 of these buildings with 320 apartments on the city's exhibition grounds and another 4 blocks of apartments, each with 16 units. As well, temporary stables for 200 horses were erected on the garrison grounds. At the height of construction, Lowe's men were completing 1 apartment every hour. The war ended in 1918, and the troops came home. Lowe's temporary structures were designed to last only 5 years. The Relief Commission authorized construction of permanent housing in the city's north end using hydrostone, a type of cement block molded under pressure. A narrow gauge railway was built to transport 3,000 blocks a day into Halifax from the hydrostone manufacturing site outside of Dartmouth. Construction lasted 2 years. These gray block hydrostone houses still stand today. For many years they were rented by the Relief Commission, but were finally sold to the tenants. Their real estate value has increased dramatically over the years. Life returned to normal, but the memory of it all remained. Words alone were inadequate to express the gratitude felt by the people of Halifax for the aid and support they had received in their hour of need, particularly from the citizens of Boston. Every year since 1920, to reaffirm their gratitude, a tall, stately Christmas tree is carefully selected and brought to the city of Boston as a gift to celebrate the spirit of goodwill and fellowship that exists to this day between the people of Halifax and the people of Boston.